Scattered throughout Minecraft are seemingly abandoned structures, strongholds, fortresses, and cities, just to name a few. Some believe that these structures were built long ago by a group of beings no longer present in the Minecraft world, or that if those beings are in the game, they looked and behaved quite differently in the past. For the sake of simplicity, I will be referring to those beings as the Ancient Builders, especially since that seems to be a common title for this group. In a previous video, I mentioned that I believe I have an explanation for how the Ancient Builders had the end stone necessary for making end portal frames, as well as how warped fungi came to exist in the Nether. However, while I was writing the rough draft for this video, I realized it was entirely too long. So, I promise I'll get to those points in this series, but I think it's necessary that I lay some groundwork first. Also, as a quick disclaimer, this is just my idea of what's going on. I play on peaceful mode, so my theory is going to be based on what I see in peaceful mode, which does mean I am disregarding a fairly sizable portion of the game's content. However, I get the impression that peaceful mode is intended to be enjoyed as a whole and complete version of Minecraft. Or at least that's what I tell myself. Since some other games have an almost belligerent attitude towards players who don't want a difficult gaming experience, I think Mojang calling the difficulty level peaceful and not something derogatory is a point in my favor. Feel free to disagree both with my assessment of peaceful mode and my theories about the Minecraft world. So with that out of the way, in order to understand what's going on with the warped fungi in the Nether, and the end stone used in end portal frames in the overworld, we need to start at the end. More specifically, the exit portal and end gateways. How do they work? As far as I can tell, they're just various pieces of bedrock arranged in specific formations that either take you back to the overworld or to another location in the end, which is odd for a few reasons. First, there's no other bedrock in the end, so where did the bedrock for making the exit portal and end gateways come from? You might think the answer is the overworld, but if that's the case, and the builders brought the bedrock with them from the overworld to the end, how did they have endstone to make the end portal frames to get to the end from the overworld? And so we're caught in this weird what came first, the chicken or the egg type of situation. Second, these portals are odd because they are made of bedrock, a material that you and I cannot mine and build with in survival Minecraft. Sure, some players are able to use bugs to break bedrock, but do they have the ability to then make a functioning exit portal or end gateway with the item? Third, these are the only two instances of naturally generating portals that are activated without you, the player, needing to place anything. Yes, you do need to defeat the game's final boss, as well as place all of the blocks necessary to get to the end, such as when making another portal, but you don't place any component of the exit portal or the end gateway yourself. This is very different from nether portals, where you need to not only arrange the obsidian in a specific formation, but also ignite the portal, such as with the flint and steel. It's also different from the end portals found in strongholds, because while you do not and cannot place end portal frames in survival, you do need to fill the frames with Eyes of Ender. Fourth, the same type of portal lets you travel within the end dimension, as well as between the end and the overworld. Sure, the arrangement of the bedrock blocks is different between the exit portal and end gateways, but the portal blocks themselves appear the same. This is in contrast to nether portals, which only ever send you from the overworld to the nether or from the nether to the overworld. You cannot use a nether portal to travel directly from one point in the nether to the other. The fifth thing that's odd about end portals is that you're transported instantly with no animation, unlike nether portals. This would seem to indicate that end portals use a faster, more efficient process for transportation than nether portals. All of these points combined lead us to our first conclusion about the Ancient Builders. They were technologically advanced, dramatically more so than the player. There is a range of technological skill within Minecraft. While villagers are able to trade and tend crops, they are unable to mine, build, or hunt. Meanwhile, piglins don't seem to tend crops, but they do engage in hunting and their own form of trading. According to Minecraft's website, piglins also used to engage in mining activities. We will revisit this specific point in a future video. However, you, the player, are able to do all of these things. You can trade, farm, build, hunt, and mine, with the exception of bedrock and end portal frames. You cannot mine bedrock, much less use it to make interdimensional and intradimensional portals. But the ancient builders could. In fact, I think they were even able to craft with bedrock. Isn't it interesting that you cannot mine end portal frames at all? And this is despite the fact that they appear to be made of endstone, which can be mined with a wooden pickaxe. If the ancient builders had the ability to use bedrock for making portals, then how much more difficult would it be for them to craft using bedrock to make more specialized portals? Wouldn't they be able to combine bedrock with the material from the end, like endstone, to take them directly to a specific location in the end, regardless of their position in the overworld? But regardless of whether the end portal frames were crafted with bedrock, these ancient builders clearly had greater crafting ability than the modern Minecraft player. Incidentally, this understanding can help us figure out where the builders came from. Currently, there is no bedrock in the end other than the exit portal and end gateways. But was that always the case? What if the ancient end used to have naturally occurring bedrock? In fact, since both the end and the nether have dim ambient light instead of a day-night cycle, the ancient end may have been encapsulated in bedrock just like the nether. And just as the piglins allegedly mined all of the netherite from the nether, the ancient builders could have mined all of the bedrock, and possibly some other materials from the end. That could explain why the only seemingly natural block left in the end is endstone. Everything else of value was mined out. However, I'm not convinced that explanation works, because we can find netherite ingots and bastion remnant chests, and there are still pieces of ancient debris left over from the piglins' mining operations. And there are no equivalent items or blocks for bedrock found in the end. At least not yet. I suppose Mojang could add something like that if and when they do update the end, but since they say on their feedback website that they won't be adding ways to obtain bedrock in survival, I tend to doubt that possibility. You could argue that the ancient builders first developed their bedrock portal technology in the overworld or nether, but if that were the case, why would they then revert to using the end portal frames in strongholds? The bedrock in both dimensions is uneven, so it may have been partially mined away, but that still doesn't explain the existence of the end portals in strongholds. Did the bedrock portals become unusable in the overworld and nether, so that the ancient builders had to use end portal frames? But if that were the case, why don't we see the remnants of bedrock portals in the overworld or the nether? After all, you can find plenty of ruined nether portals in both dimensions. One possibility is that the portals malfunctioned and were so dangerous that the builders completely destroyed them. But if that were the case, why are the end portals in the stronghold and end dimension still usable? Another possibility is that the uneven bedrock in both the overworld and the nether is actually the remnants of old portals. But I tend to think the unevenness is due to either mining, or the fact that in Minecraft borders between two naturally occurring materials like stone and dirt tend to be uneven. On the other hand, what if the end has always looked more or less like it does today? If that's the case, then the ancient builders had to have come from another dimension we haven't seen yet. After all, it has been hinted that Minecraft will receive another dimension once the existing 3 are done to Mojang's satisfaction. This brings us to my second conclusion. The ancient builders weren't from the end, and I say this because of the end rods and ender chests found in end cities. Both purpur and endstone bricks are derived from resources in the end, namely chorus fruit and endstone respectively. However, that isn't the case with end rods and ender chests. Both items require materials from the nether, specifically blaze rods or their derivative, blaze powder. It would thus seem the end cities were constructed only after the ancient builders had already visited the nether. So unless Mojang has plans to add more structures to the end, there is no evidence that an advanced civilization dwelled in the end prior to visiting the other 2 dimensions. There's a third point we learn about the builders from end cities. They were humanoid, but they weren't necessarily human. Why do I say this? The chests found in end cities contain tools, weapons, and armor that the player can use. So we could assume that whoever left these behind was just like the player. However, both villagers and piglins can wear the same exact armor. Piglins can even use the same weapons as the player. But these 2 beings are clearly very different from the player. There's also the strange interior of end cities to consider. While the base floors do have slab stairs and a ladder which are easy to climb, it gets a bit strange when you get to these slabs. The jumps aren't excessively difficult, but they don't feel like they were meant for humans to regularly travel on. It gets even weirder when you get to the loot rooms, since there is no clear walkway to the chests. Even though the rest of the structure appears to be intact, you could argue that perhaps the original walkways broke down, but then you get to these large towers, with their clear but still very strange staircases of slabs and end rods. Again, parts of the staircase may have fallen apart with time, but the structure is otherwise pristine. It's not like the strongholds in the overworld where much of the stone brick is either cracked or covered with moss, and it's not like the ruined nether portals either, where large chunks of the structure are clearly missing, damaged, or have fallen over. So what if these staircases aren't meant for beings like the player, but for a much more agile humanoid? However, it is possible that the lack of damaged blocks is meant to convey that these cities were constructed recently. Another possibility is that since there is no naturally occurring water in the end, things don't wear down as quickly. Regardless, there's something else that worries me about the exact nature of the ancient builders. End city banners look a lot like the missing texture block. A diamond pattern isn't exactly the same as a grid pattern, but I don't think the connection is unreasonable since it's the same two colors. Besides, what is a diamond pattern if not a grid pattern that has been stretched and rotated a bit? There's only one other structure I can think of that has banners on the outside of a towering building, the Pillager Tower, and on those banners is a representation of a pillager. If pillager towers are decorated with banners which portray pillagers, then shouldn't the banners on end cities portray the residents of those cities, presumably the ancient builders? The fact that it's a missing texture is more than a little scary. Is it missing because they were deleted from existence? A completely terrifying prospect by itself, made even more terrifying by the fact that in the credits for the game, various pieces of information are obscured, so something or someone being completely deleted from existence isn't quite as unlikely sounding as you might think. Of course, maybe they just weren't added to the game yet, or maybe the end cities weren't built by the ancient builders after all, but they had to be built by someone. So if they were built by a civilization which wasn't the ancient builders, did the ancient builders find some way to delete them from the Minecraft world? I don't know, but if the ancient builders were the kind of people to strip the end of all its bedrock, or other resources, I wouldn't put deleting an entire civilization past them, especially if it got in the way of their resource gathering operations. It may sound rather mean, but I'm hoping it was the first option, that the builders were the ones who were deleted, because I suspect that the ancient builders are not the kind of people you want to encounter, and nothing illustrates that point quite like the Ender Dragon. This may be controversial, but I don't think the Ender Dragon is alive. At least, not in the way a sheep or a cow is. Just listen to the sound it makes when it dies. That doesn't sound quite like an animal dying. It sounds more like mechanical parts breaking down. There's also the fact that its death sequence features explosion particles similar to TNT, and strange purple lights. This is very different from the usual turn red and fall over behavior that most mobs exhibit on death. There's also the fact that the dragon head found on end ships is very different from any other mob head in the game. When the player walks while wearing a dragon head, the jaw moves up and down, almost like an animatronic. If the Ender Dragon is an artificial lifeform constructed by the ancient builders, that could explain why this death sequence is so different. It could also explain why its death activates the exit portal and end gateways. The builders made it that way, but why would they effectively use it to guard the exit portal to the overworld? If the main objective for the builders' interdimensional travels was to extract whatever resources they could and leave, it could complicate matters substantially if someone from the overworld or nether came to the end, saw the destruction the builders left in their wake, and then returned to the overworld to warn everyone not to trust them. But that's not all. Let's go back for a moment to the dragon heads found on end ships. Their presence indicates one of two possibilities. One, the dragon is indeed some form of advanced machinery, and the ancient builders decided to decorate their ships with copies of the creation's head. Two, the builders constructed multiple dragons, and they were all killed except one, either by the builders or someone else. If there was another sentient species living in the end, did they succeed in driving the builders out of the end, destroying the monsters the builders made to fight for them, and displaying the monsters' heads to boost their morale? Did they even try to follow the builders to their home dimension? And that's why the end boss currently guards the exit portal, so that no one could go to the overworld or nether to ask for reinforcements? If so, then this paints the builders as cowards who forced their creations to protect them. But there's another explanation explanation, which might be even worse. The builders are the ones who hunted the Ender Dragons. Maybe they simply made the mob heads to decorate their ships. But what if they didn't? What if they repeatedly fought the creature, reasoning that they had to make sure it was strong enough to prevent any unauthorized person from going to the overworld? If so, then they would be killing a life form they brought into existence. And that's why I don't feel bad about defeating the End Boss. It's an artificial life form that was never meant to exist, which means its presence in the end has likely disrupted the local ecosystem significantly, and it's alone and abandoned. And then there's the egg. Some argue that because there is only one dragon left, clearly the egg cannot hatch. However, I think those individuals are forgetting that we are talking about Minecraft biology and not real-world biology, because one Minecraft chicken can lay eggs that hatch by themselves with no problems whatsoever. Besides, even in the real world, the process of parthenogenesis can enable certain animals to reproduce without a mate, including lizards. And what is Minecraft's end boss but a giant winged lizard? Regardless, getting rid of the boss before it can properly lay its egg is the right thing to do. While the dragon isn't able to fly through the exit portal to the overworld, the egg can fall through. What would happen if the egg hatched in the overworld, the Nether, or anywhere else for that matter? How many blocks and life forms would be destroyed? How many have already been destroyed in the end? So, to review the 5 things that the current end dimension teaches us about the ancient builders. Number 1, they were technologically advanced even more than the player. Number 2, while they did visit the end before coming to the overworld and the Nether, the builders were not from the end but from another dimension we haven't seen yet. Number 3, the builders were humanoid but not necessarily the same as the player. Number 4, the builders either were deleted, haven't been added to the game yet, or deleted another sentient species from the end. Number 5, they created the Ender Dragon to guard the exit portal. But the story of the ancient builders doesn't necessarily end in the end. As I mentioned earlier, Minecraft's website claims that the piglins are the ones who mined all of the netherite in the Nether, only leaving behind the occasional piece of ancient debris. But this raises an important question. How did the piglins mine all of the netherite if there are no diamonds in the Nether? Interestingly enough, you can find diamond tools, weapons, and armor in Bastion remnants. But how did they get there? I don't think it's a coincidence that you can also find diamond gear in end cities, despite there also being no diamond ore in that dimension either. But that discussion will have to wait because this video is getting entirely too long. Once I have the next video in this series ready, I'll add it to this end screen. Until next time, take care.